This is the 5-minute guide to the HMS Warspite, one of the Queen Elizabeth class and arguably one of the Royal Navy's finest warships.
The Warspite began life in 1912 as the second ship of her class to be laid down, although she received the pennant number 03 for some reason. As the sixth Royal Navy warship to bear the name, the ship had a legacy, but not one of any particular note. She would change that, proving true to her motto, which was Belli dura despicio, translated as, I despise the hardships of war. Early indications were that Warspite seemed to have a strange attraction to other objects, hitting both the seabed and two of her sister ships in 3 separate incidents during World War I. However, her reputation changed completely once the Battle of Jutland began. Early in the battle, she first opened fire at the German light cruiser Pilor, which immediately dropped smoke and retreated. Following this, despite German attempts to throw off their aim, she scored a hit on the German battlecruiser von der Tann, which likewise retreated into a smoke cloud. The Warspite would then switch fire to the Moltke, but soon found herself having to turn away from the whole of the High Seas Fleet. Although it had not been damaged up to this point, now Warspite was hit repeatedly by all sorts of shells, in return damaging the German battleship Markgraf. Whilst attempting to get back into line, damage from a shell jammed the Warspite's rudder in a hard left turn, but the ship's captain decided it would be suicide to stop the ship for repairs in the middle of a battle, and so the ship drove at full speed back around into point-blank range of the entire German fleet. Only now she was alone. As this happened, the armoured cruisers Warrior and Defence came steaming past to try and attack the crippled German cruiser Wiesbaden. The Defence was almost immediately blown out of the water by the German battleships, but the crippled Warrior staggered away before the engines gave out. They were sure to suffer a similar fate, except that then the out-of-control Warspite came careening past, a closer and far more inviting target. The ship then sustained dozens more hits, but whilst this action was somewhat unintentional, it saved the Warrior from immediate destruction, and whilst the ship had to be left to sink later on, the majority of the crew would survive, for which they were very, very grateful, as you might imagine. As a highly amusing side note, one of the German shells hit the ship's bread store, the resulting explosion sending high-speed loaves in all directions, knocking out a signalman who happened to be passing, who, upon recovery, formed the distinct impression that the Germans were in fact firing loaves of bread at his ship. After 2 full circles, a measure of control was restored, and the ship wobbled off to the northwest, where the crew would finally try and fix the rudder, as well as the 150 or so new holes in the ship. With speed restricted and rudder control not fully restored, Warspite was ordered home shortly after the German fleet retreated into the gathering darkness. It was not entirely safe yet, though. They encountered at least a couple of submarines on the way back which tried to torpedo them. In response to the second attack, the damaged ship went to maximum possible speed and attempted to ram. After receiving repairs, the ship rejoined the fleet, although odd rudder issues would occur for the rest of the ship's life, and it was present during the surrender of the German fleet at the end of the war. The ship received an extensive refit in the mid-1920s, which radically altered the ship's appearance, before it promptly rammed something again, this time a rock, and needing further dockyard work. In 1933, for a change of pace, she was rammed by a passenger ship, but suffered minimal damage. The following year she was taken into dock for a complete modernisation, receiving new engines, a new tower-style superstructure, extra armour, upgraded main guns, new anti-aircraft weapons, and some scout planes. In World War II, although assigned to the Mediterranean fleet, the loss of HMS Royal Oak saw her recalled back to the home fleet, and so her first action of the war was at the Norwegian fjord of Narvik. An earlier battle between British and German destroyers had resulted in losses on both sides. Now the mighty battleship was sent with a destroyer escort to finish the job. Along the way, her scout plane became the first aircraft to sink a submarine in the war when it bombed the U-64. The aircraft would then go on to spot and report all the German ships' positions. As you might expect, a 15-inch battleship was a hugely unequal opponent, and in the fight 8 German destroyers were sunk in exchange for 3 British destroyers damaged. Returning to the Mediterranean after some shore bombardment work, the Warspite took part in the Battle of Calabria. After British light cruisers were forced back by Italian heavy cruisers, 2 Italian battleships closed on the Warspite, which was significantly ahead of Malaya and Royal Sovereign. However, the Warspite then proceeded to hit the Italian flagship Giulio Cesare at 26,000 yards, the joint longest-range hit in naval gunnery history, and the longest-range hit between fighting battleships. This dropped the Italian ship's speed, and it hid it in a smokescreen. By the time the ship's speed was partially restored, the other two British battleships had caught up, and the Italian fleet disengaged. The Warspite then escorted the Illustrious in an airstrike on Taranto before more shore bombardment missions took place. The next action was the Battle of Cape Matapan, where the Italian battleship Vittore Veneto drove back British cruisers only to be hit by a torpedo from an airstrike by the British carrier aircraft and forced to retreat. A follow-up airstrike crippled the cruiser Pola. Whilst the battleship was fast enough to escape, however, the British pursued during the night and picked up the crippled cruiser, her two sister ships, and two destroyers on radar. Activating searchlights at point-blank range, the 5 Italian ships were blown to pieces by the Warspite, Barham, and Valiant. This action crippled Italian operations in the area for quite some time. The Warspite then covered the evacuation of Crete and was hit by German bombers as a result. She was sent to the United States for repairs, returning to action in the Indian Ocean, where she played a game of cat and mouse with the Japanese, although no major action came from this. She returned to the Mediterranean in 1943 to assist the Allied landings in Sicily and Italy. With the Italian surrender, she escorted a number of old enemies into the harbour at Malta, but the modern Italian battleship Roma was missing, having been sunk by a massive German Fritz-X guided bomb. A few weeks later, Warspite would be on the receiving end of 3 such bombs. One missed, the second was a near miss that ripped open the torpedo defences, and the third smashed through the deck and blew a 20-foot hole in the ship's bottom. However, the ship survived and was towed to Malta for emergency repairs before making her way back to the UK for more extensive repairs. At one point in the journey, she broke all tow cables and therefore passed through the Straits of Messina in a sideways drift. Although one boiler room and one of the rear turrets could not be repaired in time for the Normandy landings, she was sent with an increased anti-aircraft battery to support the invasion, becoming the first ship to open fire at 5 in the morning on the 6th of June. Exhausting her entire stock of shells, she went back across the channel, rearmed, and came back to do it again, ran out of shells a second time, and went back for more. It was discovered that she had worn out her guns with all this firing, and she was sent north to get new ones, in the process becoming the first battleship to pass through the Straits of Dover since the war started, taking no damage from German coastal batteries, although she did manage to hit a mine later on. With new guns installed, she gradually worked her way up and down the French coast alongside Royal Navy monitors, bombarding various German positions before retiring back to port at the end of 1944. There was no time to give her the needed repairs and overhaul in time to send her to the Far East for operations against Japan, so her active career ended at this point and the Japanese would escape her wrath. There was some serious thought given to turning her into a museum ship, which in my opinion was the least she deserved. But ultimately, the decision was made in 1946 to scrap her, which remains one of the greatest injustices to a warship that I can think of. However, Warspite was not quite done. This was a ship that had survived the guns of the entire high seas fleet. It had evaded countless torpedoes, sunk, crippled, or damaged numerous enemy ships, come through admittedly ramming ships, rocks, and mines, taken multiple hits from the Luftwaffe, survived a direct hit from a guided missile that had destroyed a much larger and more modern battleship, and then literally worn out her own guns blasting Nazi forces off the European coast. This ship was not going to go to the scrapyard quietly. On the 19th of April 1947, the ship was being towed to the scrapyard when a storm sprang up. The ship took the opportunity to promptly slip both of the tugs, rip clear of her anchor, and ram the Mount Mopus ledge. Refloating herself, she then went hard aground in Prussia Cove. Multiple salvage attempts followed, but the ship stubbornly refused to cooperate, the operations resulting in damage or grounding to a salvage vessel and 2 tugs. The sum total of these efforts moved the ship only a few hundred yards, and she finally settled to the bottom of the sea, defiant to the last. After all she'd been through, Warspite was not going to anyone's breaker's yard. With 15 battle citations, the ship had gathered a legend about itself, becoming the most decorated ship in the Royal Navy. Her name lived on in a new nuclear submarine that was only decommissioned in 1991, and it is rumoured that one of the 4 new Dreadnought-class ballistic missile submarines will carry the name into a 9th iteration. If so, then all hail the new Warspite.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.